I read Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age by Ada Palmer. This is a reread for me. It's a popular history book, so it's not written in an academic style with lots of jargon. In fact, it's like extremely not written for an academic audience in some ways. It's very calibrated to be delivered to people who don't know much about history and who have preconceived notions about what the Renaissance is. That's kind of what the whole book is about. And it also demystifies some of how academic history works, like academia itself. And so I think in the pop consciousness, there's an idea that like history is a thing that happened, it's objective, it's like science. There's no like question that certain things happened. And then it's the job of historians to just like make it simple enough for us to understand what those things were. And if you actually get into academic history, what you find out is like we know very little about the past compared to like what happened. There's like a huge amount of information that we just don't have access to anymore. All kinds of things were destroyed or lost. And we just don't know a ton about the past. And every once in a while, we'll find things that will completely change how we view the past. So we might discover documents that reveal parts of history that we just weren't aware of, or something gets translated, or something gets found in a library, whatever. Archaeological digs, all that kind of stuff contributes to like new history being found. And you'd be like, how can there be new history? It already happened. And that's the kind of thing that she explains in the book. We have a notion of what the Renaissance is, a kind of golden age where modernity was started and kind of like a secular humanism emerged, and we threw off all of the superstition of the Dark Ages and emerged into a scientific age. And it was like a very special time where all kinds of incredible art was produced. And it was like a little utopia that gave birth to our current modern age. And instead, what she shows is that the Renaissance was much longer than you would usually think. And it was actually an extremely dangerous time. There was not a utopia at all. It was a very difficult place to live because you had plagues, you had vendettas, you had very powerful people who were not interested in creating a fair and just society, but who wanted to increase their own power and constantly go to war with each other, like forever and ever and ever. It's kind of amazing the things that came out of the Renaissance, given everything that she talks about, how violent and crazy everything was. The book's also very funny. So I talked about, how it has its use of language and stuff like that is aimed at a popular audience, not an academic audience. So what I mean is it's not full of jargon, it's not full of dates, and it's not doing heavy citation of other sources. Instead, she's like renaming things so that it's easier for somebody who's not familiar with this period in history to remember what she's talking about. So, for example, she talks a lot about Florence, Italy in the book. And Florence had a government system where there were like a group of 9 people who were in charge, and she calls them like 9 dudes in a tower. And which kind of like minimizes their political importance, but also kind of correctly frames that they were stooges to the Borgia family for a lot of times. So like people would give lip service to the 9 dudes in a tower, but they would do, if they wanted to do broker deals, they would go and contact the Borgias and say like, can we do this or that with Florence and not deal with these other guys? Or she talks about the various popes in this period of time who were pretty much always bad and started wars. And so for one of the popes, she calls him Battle Pope 1, and then there's Battle Pope 2 instead of giving their names because, like, it can get confusing with names and dates, especially of popes, I find, because they just like, they all have the same names. It's like Pius the what or John the who or, over and over and over. And they don't go by their birth name. They get renamed when they become a pope. And so Battle Pope 1 and Battle Pope 2 is just easier to grab onto, at least for me as a reader who is not familiar with this time period and all the different people. But it's not just taking away kind of the names and being more casual with stuff like that. I think it's very like thoughtfully deployed the way that she's doing it, but she's also very playful in her language and a lot of affection for history itself and the important people in history comes across as well. So she's constantly referring to the various historical personalities as our friends. And it has a certain effect that even though these people will often be in conflict with each other, or they might be people that we wouldn't personally like to hang out with, as it relates to learning about the period, they are important for us to get to know in a vulnerable, intimate kind of way, as close as we can get to them anyway. And so she calls people like Machiavelli our friend, or the Borgias our friend. And those are usually people that are depicted as unfriendly. They're villainous, usually, when they're talked about in history. To be Machiavellian is to be like evil, is usually what that is an accusation of. But she gives a lot of context to Machiavelli's life and his political philosophy and why that came out the way that it did at the time. A lot of times, if you read The Prince or, learn about it in college, which I think is how most people encounter it, the book is presented in kind of a vacuum and not given context for what was happening. Like, why did Machiavelli write this? What was going on in Florence at the time, or in Italy at large at that time? And it really changes the way that you look at the advice in that book once you understand everything that Ada Palmer lays out. So, for example, he was, exiled from Florence, which was the place that he cared about the most in the world. And the city had been a republic where the citizens could vote on their leaders, or some of the citizens. I mean, it's not like a full-on democracy or something. But they were allowed to vote for their leaders, and they didn't have, like a king or something like that. And then all of that fell apart. And there was a real danger of the city just being destroyed because of, France invading and all of these different factions fighting. And so he mainly just wanted to teach any leader who was going to take over Florence, whether they dealt with him or not, how to shore up their power and then deploy that power in the defense of the city that he cared about so much. And so it wasn't about like, oh, you got to do the right thing or you got to do the wrong thing. It was like, this is an emergency and you have to use power right now to make this emergency stop, And so understanding The Prince in that context really changes things from being like, oh man, this guy just doesn't care about justice or fairness. And, you just lie to people's faces and it's better to be feared than loved and all of this kind of stuff. But when you're, when the house is on fire, your priorities end up changing. And Machiavelli was worried about Florence being destroyed. And so that was part of the reason why he wrote the book. One of the big things about the book that I like is that it confirms things that I already think, which is always a good feeling. So it doesn't really broaden my horizons, but I'm like, hey, somebody with credentials said that I'm right. So for one thing, I'm mostly self-taught. I went to a little bit of college, but I'm an autodidact. I'm an autistic guy who reads tons of books. And so something I noticed when I started reading history books is that I would, pick a subject and I would read a history book by one person and then read another history book about the same thing by a different person, and they did not agree with each other, and this really confused me and bothered me. I was like, wait a minute, isn't the past just like it's just a bunch of facts, like there's nothing, how can you disagree with each other about what happened? But it turns out that academics are kind of marking their territory and saying, this, I believe that this happened, and another historian says, no, I believe that this other thing happened, or here's the reasons why it happened, and this other guy is wrong. And this is, how you stake out a career, by making a bold claim and then proving that it's correct and everybody else bows down, or at least that's how it seems to me. So I didn't really understand at first that writers of history might have a bias or a point of view. I just thought that they were describing objective facts. And a big point of this book is to let people in on that side of writing history, that she says, I, Ada Palmer, have a point of view, and you should not totally trust me. And you should maybe not totally trust any history book that you write. You have to just take it, and learn what you can from it, but also consider that you're going to have to check it across other sources and consider their bias, and on like that. And so the book, I think, helps people who are not academics to become more sophisticated when they are approaching nonfiction. You should not just take everything as objective facts, despite the fact that the people writing it are credentialed. Like Ada Palmer is a PhD, she is a professor, she is an accomplished fiction writer in her own right, and all of these things. But despite that, she says, hey, you shouldn't totally trust me because I have a dog in the fight of what the Renaissance means and where it comes from. And then a lot of the rest of the book is also about other people's claim to the Renaissance, that people want to say, well, the Renaissance happened because of this X factor, and it kicked off this other thing that is like their thing. And for that reason, they're going to pick, the X factor is art, or the X factor is insurance and banking, or whatever it is that was important in the Renaissance. When the Renaissance is made up, of course, of all of these factors simultaneously. Just like our own time period is extremely complex, any given time period in the past was equally as complex in its own setting. So it's nice to read a book and just have that laid out in the open and say, like, here is what is going on. I really, really appreciate Ms. Palmer doing that. It's great. The other thing that she writes about that also confirmed a thing that I've been telling people for years, based on, again, reading history, is about the Inquisition and how, while it was draconian and punished people unfairly, it did not necessarily target atheists or scientists specifically. So there's this kind of narrative in modern times that the Inquisition was the prime tool of the church to fight against science and atheism, the rise of human secularism, and this whole like science versus religion kind of vibe to it that we have now in modern times. And then they project it back into the past and they say, yeah, that was always there. Like, look at what happened to Copernicus. And it's just simply not true. Like, not in the terms that people tried to make it. Like, they just didn't care very much about atheists, because it was like, who would ever be an atheist? Like, they were worried about people believing in God the wrong way. They were hunting down Jews, Muslims, people who had, obscure splinter versions of Catholicism that were weird to them. Or, once the Protestant Reformation happens, Lutheranism and all of the other various splinters that happen from, Anabaptists and on and on and on. That's the stuff the Inquisition cared about. Or they were used, as a tool against the political enemies of the church to, break into somebody's house and like, oh, ho, you have some forbidden books here. Well, we're going to have to confiscate your stuff and put you in a prison. Some trumped up charges, in other words. And it wasn't so much about policing people's study of science. And in fact, the study of science was considered to be one of the avenues of proving the existence of God. And so that kind of blows modern people's minds, but it's like something that I've been on about for, I don't know, like 25 years, or from like 9/11. And it's just because I know that from reading history books again, like, not to like stick up for religion or anything, but I don't know, there was just a real rise of atheism in the culture after 9/11 and a real anti-Muslim sentiment on every political spectrum, I feel like. And I just felt like it was unfair and unearned. And the way that that conflict, that ideological conflict was framed, was as if religion had always been anti-scientific, when, at least in Europe, religion is the taproot of the study of the natural world. The entire university system is based off of the monastic system. And so, yeah, she does a good job of pointing that stuff out in the book. And she also talks about life expectancy, which is another thing that I've talked to people about and had that correct me and be like, oh, no, yes, people died when they were young, but, if you managed to get past 20 years old, then you had a good chance of making it to be as old as anybody is nowadays, 60, 70, 80. Some people even live to be 100. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but it wasn't true in Renaissance Italy, because you had the plague on one hand and you had these never-ending wars and feuds on the other, and people were getting assassinated all the time, and there was vendettas, and France would invade and the Pope would invade, and then the Reformation happens, and then it starts getting really bad. So like, while it's true that human beings have been able to live into their 70s, 80s, 90s for thousands of years, if they survive that long and remain healthy, it wasn't true in Europe, especially at this time period from like the late 1300s on into 1600s, just because of the level of violence that was happening, I think. There's a few things in here that I think she does that are really, really smart to help people get a grasp of the timeline of the Renaissance, which is a huge amount of time depending on who you're talking to. And so she kind of embraces everybody's perspective on the Renaissance, at least how it relates to Italy in particular. She doesn't really deal with like, the Renaissance in France or England or anything like that. She's like focused really in on Italy. But this cool thing that she does is relate the dates in Renaissance Italy to the 20th century. And so starting at 1900, she says, like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, kind of adding hundreds of years to the date to give you a sense of how much time is going by in this whole thing. And when she gets to the end, we're like in 2130 or something like that. And so you're talking like that just makes it really come home for me how much time is passing. because we tend to think of the Renaissance as just like this very compact period of time where all of this amazing, innovation happened. But it was actually a really long spread out time that encompassed like 150, 200 years or something. So it's like, it's a crazy amount of time, at least given our perspective on it. And she makes this other really good point in that same section where she talks about how we tend to like see time periods as distinct and kind of in their own milieu or their own bubble, kind of, where you would say like the 1920s is a whole oeuvre, and then that has very little to do with like World War I or World War II, even though it's like a decade from each of those things. And that the two world wars are very, very distinct from each other and totally different than each other and should be understood in those terms. But that probably if we were looking back on other wars that happened in such close proximity of decades, we would just lump them together because they are obviously directly related to each other in a cause and effect relationship. And so separating them is a little bit silly, but that is what we do right now in our version of history. But in, 400 years, are humans going to do that? Are they going to look back at those wars and say they were two different things, or are they going to lump them together? Probably lump them together. And so in the same way, we are kind of taking this huge amount of time and compacting it down and saying, oh yeah, it was this one moment called the Renaissance. And so it takes a little bit of unwinding of that default view of history to be like, no, wait a minute. There's a lot of time going on here, and there's a whole bunch of things to consider. So this book is like really, really big. It's a real doorstopper. It took a while to get through. I enjoy it every time I come back to it. She's so funny in her voice. Every time she makes the joke of like those darn kids and, and that kind of thing, where she talks about like the youth today are being corrupted by harmonies in Catholic music and things like that were going on, like 600, 800 years ago. Cracks me up every time. She just has a really good sense of how to put these things in the modern vernacular in an entertaining and memorable way. And I think that's down to more than a decade of teaching history, besides just knowing the history so well because of her studying and her excellent education. And so I think you can really see the fruit of all of her pedagogy in the book. She talks about the kind of things that she does in the class to teach, especially Machiavelli, and this whole like kind of simulation thing that she does around the election of a pope to illustrate how history is simultaneously driven by enormous forces, social forces, but is influenced by individuals at the same time. And so there's not like this nice choice between great man history and kind of teleological inevitable history, that there's a merging of different things, but that ultimately there is a kind of systemic structure to the era in particular that makes Machiavelli's approach to power and to politics make a lot of sense. And it's really, I think, the origin point. She doesn't say this in the book, but every time that I read the book, I have this thought that I think his politics are like a real origin point for the Enlightenment kind of realpolitik approach, where you just have to assume that people in power are going to use that power to the greatest extent to like empower themselves, like people will turn into tyrants if you give them power, essentially. And so if you can craft self-consciously a government that systemically has inertia against that trend, you can kind of keep people in check and have a more structured society that is essentially more fair. And weirdly, I think that starts with Machiavelli, who is kind of saying the opposite, that you have to consolidate power, you have to exploit power. But, constitutionalism might have something of a debt to Machiavelli, is, I guess, the claim that I am making. She doesn't make this claim in the book, but I think it's there to see if you're looking for it. So in that way, I guess the point that I'm making is that I find the book really stimulating. It gets me thinking about other eras of history, how they link up to this point in history, how important a lot of the ideas are, but also how the work is not totally finished in this time, and how history is an ongoing process that we are in the middle of, and that we should kind of think about our time in history. We can't possibly know how people are going to view what's going on in the world right now, 400, 800 years from now, but we should have an awareness that we are participating in something much larger than the era that we're in, and that as much as people have always been the same throughout history, that doesn't mean that they were exactly like us with the kind of worldview that we have. And in fact, the way that they saw the world could be useful for how history might see us in the future. So we have something to learn from the past so that we can pay it forward to the people who are coming, is kind of the point that I'm making. So always valuable to read an Ada Palmer book, and especially this doorstopper of a book is always really good one to come back to.